Very much, Annette. So you survived the failing PowerPoint projection. That's brilliant. So speaker's able to deal with it. Very good. Two rather different perspectives on the same question, really, which is how can research make more impact on policy and practice? The IDRC study, taking a kind of case study, rich case study approach, looking at IDRC-supported projects, working with researchers, found that researchers kind of evolve different ways of dealing with different contexts that they find themselves in, and that the context change, so they also need to change. And Annette's study, a literature review, looking at particularly at methods for evaluating the impact of research on policy, possibly of rather more interest for donors, but certainly very useful for researchers who are trying to think about how they can maximise the impact of their work on policy. We have about 40 minutes left for questions, and we will take questions and comments from the floor, but also the people listening in online, there's a facility that they can post questions, so we may get some questions from them also. We had a meeting at this time about 2 months ago, and we had a question that came in from Sri Lanka where it must have been 1 a.m, and another one from Montevideo where it was about lunchtime. So it's quite interesting, different perspectives. Very impressive that somebody's watching this at 1 a.m. also. So we'll see what we get. If you want to make a comment or ask a question, please stand up, say your name and where you're from, and try and keep it brief, 1 or 2 minutes rather than a long diatribe. And to facilitate the use of a microphone, we'll kind of go in waves across the room. So if a number of hands go up, we'll follow the hands across the room and see where we get to. In the sort of blurb about the meeting, we posed 3 questions which we may or may not wish to address. And now, does research influence public policy and decision making, and if so, how? Well, lots of examples, particularly from Fred, of where it has in developing countries. What methods for evaluating the impact of research on policy provide the most useful information, particularly from Annette's talk? And a sort of a more discursive question, who needs to do what to ensure that we make the most of development research? Well, let's see if we want to address those. Who wants to start? Okay, we'll start this way and move across. And what we'll try and do is stick to a topic. So if your hand up here was up and you want to talk about something completely different, we may come back to you later on. Kike.
Hi, my name is Enrique Rizal from ODI, from Rapid Group. I have a lot of questions, but I'll stick to just 2. One is a comment. First thing is a comment, and I think the first presentation has been mostly about researchers, what researchers can do, and the second presentation has been mostly about research. I've tried to count the difference of the word, the use of words, and I think this is an important thing. And on the one hand, I feel research has an influence. I think we can agree that it has an influence. I think we probably don't know how much, or whether the amount of influence it has is enough, but that's another question, how much is enough? And then the other one is whether researchers are influential themselves, and I sometimes feel I don't really care. What I care is that good research gets into policy, whether it's because of the researcher's own activities, or because somebody else picked it up, or some other sort of intermediary organization, or a political body, or an interest group. And so I think that, I wonder if that, I ask it as a question, is that comment, does it make sense or not? And then the other, the question I have to do with, when we've been looking at research, are we, in both cases, are we looking at individual papers, individual studies, bodies of knowledge, a collection of researchers' work over a lifetime or over a decade, a research program? Because then it's different. What you can do with an individual paper is very different from what you can do with 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8 papers and a body of knowledge. And I wonder if that's something you look into.
Okay, do you want to talk about that? I mean, about kind of what influences policy, individual study versus body of work, individual versus knowledge?
I think so. My name is Joanne Craig. I work in DFID's research department, and my question is to Fred. And it is, what are the implications from a funding perspective in that, and this is why I think it's linked, should our expectation be that we should be paying researchers for more time to do this these very complex set of tasks that are quite time-consuming in terms of building up trust and understanding the context and so on. I mean, that's a big activity. And or should we expect that they are sufficiently multi-skilled that we can expect these sort of super people who are both academically very highly qualified in their field and able to deliver robust epidemiology or robust anthropology, as well as being able to do that translational thing? And the specific case you raised was, for example, around the Philippines, around replication of methodology. And should it be researchers who do that or something else?
Stephen Yo from CEPR. Just going through the 5 different contexts that you mentioned, Fred, there's something that kind of puzzled me about them, because in a way they're very old-fashioned in the following sense, that they assume that there's a policymaker who needs to be influenced. And if you think that way, and that's natural maybe in the IDRC context to sort of think about things in that manner, and then think about the quote from Maureen O'Neill that you mentioned, which is all about fostering democratic debate. There's a complete disconnect between those 2 approaches, because your typology, which is a good one and very interesting, has nothing to do with debate. You see, in your typology, the only time that researchers go out and talk to ordinary people is if they don't have any policymakers willing to listen to them. So the democratic debate seems to be a sort of tiresome thing that they got to do when they can't find a policymaker who's willing to listen to them. And so I think at the back of that 5 context thing, there's a Singapore kind of model, a sort of honest government, maybe a little bit ill-informed, and good research can inform it better. But it's nothing to do with democracy and debate. And because that seems to be a sort of tiresome complication in that framework. And I think to researchers, that's probably correct. That's the way they would see it, that all that messy stuff with NGOs and advocacy and politics is something that 95% of them don't want to touch at all. They're only really happy talking to some guy behind the desk who's kind of like them, but on the other side of the divide. So I'm wondering if there's something slightly wrong with that framework in the context of your own president, your own ex-president's view of the role of research.
Okay, thanks, Ian. We'll hold on to that and get your chance to respond to that. But how about we continue the discussion about, whether researchers or other people should get involved in, as Stephen describes it, all that messy stuff in order to maximise the impact on policy. Does anybody want to pick up that conversation? I will pass you my own microphone.
Well, I am one of those people who does all the messy stuff. I come from an activist NGO, and I am very interested in that comment, because certainly from our standpoint, we very much depend on information that is fed to us by researchers. Now, I work specifically in human rights, trade justice and the tourism field. And what is very clear to me is that there's a lot of research out there. People are doing a huge amount of research on human rights, on development, but it never gets to the policymakers. So is it our role to do that? And if so, how come when we desperately ask people for their research, we never get it? There seems to be a reluctance or from our point of view, again, there's a reluctance from the researchers, or perhaps mechanisms aren't there to get that information to people who want to change, want to be a change agency. I mean, that's our role. Our role is to be a change agency. And I'd be very interested to know anybody's insights on that whole process.
Thank you very much. You stood up, which nobody else has, but you didn't say your name unless I missed it.
Guillaume James from Tourism Concern.
Thank you very much. Not only do researchers not want to do the messy stuff, they don't even want to talk to people who do the messy stuff. Yeah. Does anybody want to comment on that? Is that sort of hand kind of almost... Sorry? Anybody you want to pick up on that? We'll, make sure you stick your hand up firmly when we get to the end of the round. We'll come back to you.
Do you want me to stand up or?
No, fine, just say your name.
Phil Sigley, Federation of Cocoa Commerce. I'm not sure whether this also relates to the difficulties of monitoring and evaluation on the lady's last point there. I think, for example, DFID has been criticised in the Select Committee and others on its monitoring and evaluation on, for example, if you were to look at budgetary assistance, which is something we have a bit of a problem with, then when you want information, I mean, you could go to, for example, villages that might have been recipients of a structure that's been put in place by the EU or by DFID or others. But when you look at the impact of what's happened from the top, how the money hasn't actually moved down under the poverty reduction strategy for that country, that is a difficulty. I can understand why people think, well, is this working or is this not working? Now, researchers, do they go into the kind of detail? Are they funded to go in? Does DFID want to hear that kind of stuff? And I think that's a bit of a challenge from our point of view. Okay, I come from a private sector organisation and probably outnumbered here, but it is a concern. Thank you.
Yes, just pass the microphone forward, please.
David Maidment, Railway Children Chairman. I'd like to explore this messy stuff and the fact that we sometimes work with researchers who are very precious about the quality of the research they're doing, but we have problems with timescales when we have opportunities to influence policy, and the researchers are somewhat reluctant sometimes to actually compromise their research when there is actually an opportunity for change. I'd like to ask questions about comments about how to tackle that one.
Anybody want to comment on that particular topic, and then maybe we'll come back to the speakers and hear from them.
Hi, I'm Catherine Hilario, and just wanted to make a comment about the earlier suggestion about who actually is in charge of delivering the research into policy context. I come from the Philippines, and you've given a good you mentioned a decentralized idea of research, and I've worked in the same province in Palawan. So the kind of model that we've made is a participatory one. I've led the participatory research, baseline research. It's actually a baseline research for monitoring and evaluation of their sustainable livelihoods program. And the way we deliver the research, from the time that we've designed the research program, we've done consultations with the government, with NGOs, grassroots community organizations, and of course, when the duration of the research, we've actually had local research volunteers who participated in the project. And so in that way, it has somehow, because we do have local researchers who have links to governments, in that way it has actually influenced policymaking in terms of establishing, let's say, an environmental project, which concerns environmental project on establishing of marine protected areas of that sort. So somehow it does have a link, but I do perfectly agree that there is a big gap in how do we actually utilize researches available or research outcomes available in the website or from big organizations who does not actually reach the masses, or which doesn't come into maximum benefit for people who should be utilizing the research or the outcomes in order to influence policy and make a very substantive change in terms of policy making. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. Enrique, you're keen to say something about this?
Just my original question was to do with individual research, body of research, etc. But I think another question is the type of research. So you mentioned participatory research. I would find it very difficult if somebody claiming to do participatory research wouldn't want to engage with policymakers early on and discuss with different stakeholders. I would find it very difficult for somebody who is in a university department in Latin America, trade, Latin network, Alan Ferrer, one of the people there, who's doing econometric analysis of trade effects on different issues in the country, to want to engage until his research is done. And he would fight it till the end. And then do we want to force him to engage? Maybe not, because otherwise he won't be able to bring about change eventually. I don't know.
Okay, Fred, Annette, would you like to respond to these? Fred, I think you ought to respond to Stephen's comment about whether you're being rather old-fashioned considering researchers trying to influence policymakers. Annette, I don't know whether, and anything else you want to respond to as well, but particularly that one. Annette, you might want to respond to the point that Phil raised about whether researchers, if I understood it correctly, whether researchers really are genuinely interested in finding out what's happening to the results of their research. Is that what you meant?
I can explain that a bit better if you like, as an example, building on the Philippines.
Okay, well, that would be helpful.
I think building on the comment from the lady about the Philippines, for example, if you go digging, you have to go digging to find that there are monitoring and evaluation reports. Now, if you're a researcher, this lady from the Philippines may have had to do a participatory approach, but there are, in government circles, it is known that these reports and studies are available. Now, I had to go digging around in actually a district assembly in Ghana to actually get the information, because I found, unless I got there, there's no way of getting that information, but this is what told you that the school requirement in that area was for 500 school blocks. Availability was 10. That 87% of people, for example, in a particular district, didn't have clean water. Now, this information, whether it's available to district, I don't know, but when you try to make general inquiries, now this will come from all different levels of researchers who may want to track in, may make inquiries, and we're told there's nothing there. But in fact, I suppose, if those have commissioned or have a particular, for example, a budgetary assistance model, there must be monitoring and evaluation against that, which should be more publicly available. I think there should be more interaction to give that information up, unless I can't believe why it would not be offered up to research.
Okay, well, let's pick part of that, because I thought the first part of that was very interesting. So not only do we have researchers that don't want to do the messy stuff, researchers don't want to talk to people that do the messy stuff. Policymakers and people who commission research actually would quite like to bury quite a lot of the reports and not make it available to researchers. That might be an interesting thing to look at. Do you want to pick up on?
Yeah, I think there are several things going on there, and I think the communication bit of it is the difficult bit. It's about how people talk to each other, the kind of culture of getting together and exchanging ideas. But at the same time, I think there's a whole separate area of kind of knowledge into policy, which is about knowledge management systems, making documents available online, just being smarter really at making sure the knowledge we have is accessible in a very straightforward way, about making sure things are put in place so people can access them. I think researchers are certainly very unsophisticated in their kind of, we're very based in a culture of, I am a researcher, I'm very based in a culture of kind of paper reports and hard copy and not necessarily communication. I think it's easy to lose sight of the fact that one of the things we're talking about here is actually knowledge management. It's about making sure things are accessible before we get into this kind of messy area about how we communicate better and how we kind of individuals advocate better for their research. I thought Enrique's distinction between research and researchers is a very useful way of starting to unpack a bit what's going on in kind of knowledge transfer. And certainly I think I've been very guilty in the past of kind of losing ownership of something when I've finished writing it, and feeling that the research is done, and as a researcher I've moved on to something very different. I think if there was a slightly different culture in terms of ownership, that we continue to have a responsibility to advocate and kind of work with our research after we've finished using it, it would be kind of quite a useful culture shift really, that sort of the research you've been involved in, you as a researcher continue to have some kind of responsibility to that research over time. And we definitely have a kind of cut-off point type concept. I think the thing about kind of what we look at, whether programs or individuals, the studies that are out there do both. And a lot of evaluations are kind of programs and kind of nested studies within them of kind of bits of the program. And some of the studies that look at individuals are quite interesting in terms of this idea of how important the individual is. There's a really interesting study following a kind of medical researcher who's like been a massive name in his field. And then the assumption with it is if they track this guy over time and his papers, you can find out, it was stuff done 20 years ago, you could track it in all the places it went. But actually the most interesting thing they found in the study, it was the people who worked for him and where they went and their careers and the work that they'd done and how they talked about communicating and the ownership they had of that research that made a real difference. Because they took those ideas into lots of different worlds and contexts. And they acted as, they couldn't remember actually what they'd done specifically, but they were acting as kind of conduits to knowledge to lots of different worlds. And so it actually wasn't really about him, but it was still about people and how important they are to the process. I could go on. I'll stop.
Yeah, Fred.
Okay, thanks. Just to add, I think, on the distinction between research and researchers, which I think is a good one, one of the things we also found is that intent actually matters. Whether or not you're trying to make a difference does matter with how successful you are in actually doing it. So I think that's just another important point in terms of both the researchers and what research they choose to do. I want to try to answer the next three or four questions together. Are researchers actually multi-skilled? And Stephen's question on this doesn't tell us beyond the policymakers who need to be influenced, and the issues of why can't we get the research. At one of our first workshops when we were sharing the initial findings with researchers and IDOC program officers in Latin America, one of the researchers, and it was somebody from the Latin network but not Alan, said, you want us to be like Aaron Brockovich. You want us to have the looks, the brains, the money. You want us to do everything. And we can't. We're researchers. Some of the examples where we've seen in these different contexts success and failure is where the researchers have not done it all themselves, but have actually found ways to work with different groups and different organizations. And the two examples I wanted to give you were both examples from mining in Peru. One from an activist NGO, Labor, which was working on the issue of mine tailings and the health damage that was caused because these mine tailings were going into the local river. So they did research on the topic, which they then advocated with the community to put forward what the danger was to the community. And clearly the community had very mixed feelings because they knew their health was being compromised, but this was also the only employer that they really had. So they didn't want to be doing things that were going to shut them out of employment, yet they didn't want their health to be compromised. Through a constellation of events and the establishment at this point in the International Water Tribunal II, the NGO identified a mechanism that they could actually use to put forward the issue. With strong community support, they were able to actually put forward problems that were being created. And in fact, before the case went before the tribunal, the mining company changed their practice and changed the way they dealt with the mine tailings to reduce the problem quite significantly. And in fact, that has held over time. The other mining case that went quite the other way was the question of artisanal mining at high altitude. So artisanal mining is where you have individuals who are going out panning, going through the streams, digging on an individual basis, as opposed to big mines. And there's obviously all sorts of risks to any miner who operates that way because of the exposure they're putting themselves into all range of metals. But the question they were concerned about was, is it even worse at high altitudes than at low altitudes? Because they felt that it probably was. Now, people who live at high altitudes, overall, their systems do adjust in certain ways to living at high altitudes. But they thought there was, but they felt that there was probably more damage. They did their research. They discovered there was indeed significantly more damage, and that there were measures that could be put in place to mitigate. They ran into two problems when they put forward their findings. The first one, and probably in some ways the most important, was the community fundamentally didn't believe the findings. They didn't believe the results. And at the same time, the government had no real interest in dealing with the issue because of the costs that were implied, and so they shut it down as well. So in effect, they failed in that effort because they couldn't engage support from either the community side or from the policymaker side. So I just wanted to raise those because they do show the linkages back to an activist agenda, often on research findings, sometimes deliberate and sometimes less deliberate. And in that sense, I think that the idea of the 5 contexts that I presented don't tell you how the research gets carried out, don't tell you what gets done in the process. And so that's not something that I talked about very much because in a number of the cases, those are 2 examples. In a number of the cases, the exposure of communities to the findings led communities to become quite active. In another case in India, a network that was advocating for the use of local knowledge in the policy-making process, so that it wasn't only formal knowledge about medicine, but it was also local knowledge about medicine that was being used in the policy-making process about health services, worked very actively with local communities in order to get people aware of the fact that if they went one direction, they left out local knowledge, they would have real gaps in the health policy system, and use the communities and the media to actually put a lot of pressure on the government system. So there was that kind of debate, that was that kind of openness and bringing of knowledge into the system that goes beyond describing what the context is, but to how the influence actually occurred.
Unless you've really got something you want to say now, can we pause there?
Sure.
Because we'll come back to you again at
Yep.
the end. I thought you deflected Stephen's exercise very nicely there. So you buy the argument that in fact the researchers are very much involved with all stakeholders in an often local context in order to try and contribute to the discourse which results in policy change. I mean, I think that's quite a convincing story. I suggest you stay on afterwards and have a drink and sort it out over drinks. I noticed that 2 people from DFID walked in right at the beginning. I think DFID is probably, as you know, the largest single research donor in the world at the moment. I just wondered whether you wanted to make a comment at all on the question which several people raised about who should do this stuff. Should researchers do this stuff, or should other people be doing this stuff? And please feel free to say no, since I've just dumped it on you. Do you want to comment on that? I know you've given it a lot of thought. You've paid us to help you with the thinking about it.
I can feel a no coming, but I'm actually just going to pass the responsibility backwards and further up management's chain.
From a DFID perspective, I'm working DFID research along with, I can see at least 4 other colleagues here who've all put their heads down. That one's just about to walk out the door. But DFID, we have a policy whereby we ask research programs to allocate a proportion of their spend to getting research into use, which is primarily about better communication of research. So the responsibility within research programs is to have a strategy in place to communicate research, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be done by the researchers themselves. So we also support a range of programs that work as knowledge intermediaries or infomediaries. People use a range of words to describe them, that in some cases act as knowledge translators, in some cases act as synthesizers of research across a range of themes. In some cases they work directly with disseminating simple messages from research direct to end users, especially people who may not necessarily usually get access to the research. Is that?
Yeah, very good. Okay.
Can I contribute to this debate? I'm also in DFID, and I'm Richard Thomas, and I was once, like other colleagues here, an academic, so I'm aware of the divided loyalties and the divided philosophies. I think there is, as always, a history to all of this. The DFID research expanded because we realized we needed a lot more evidence base to what we did around the world and to explain to ourselves and the community and the taxpayers why we were doing certain things. And that evidence base wasn't just saying, here's a lot of money, go and do some interesting research, and if we have time, we'll read it. That was substantially what happened initially. Then we said, well, we must tell researchers they must present stuff to us in a user-friendly way, us and the ministers and so on being the users. And that didn't really work either. So we're trying to create a dialogue where we're saying we still need first-rate research. We're going to be a little more prescriptive about subject areas because there are policy issues up there and out there we really must address. I mean, take climate change as a new one that everybody's aware of. We must have research in these areas. We must work together to define what they are. You guys must do the research, because that's what you're good at. But then we must work together on disseminating it and understanding it and thinking of its policy implications. I was at a meeting that wasn't quite a shouting match. Researchers said, we provide you with the stuff, your job to deal with the policy. And different people were saying, well, we need, can't you tell us the policy relevance of your research? It was a bit of a dialogue of the deaf a few years ago. And I think we're at a new stage of saying, unless we work on this together, things will fall off the edge. We won't understand. We will pass like ships in the night. We have to do this jointly. If we do, then the transition from doing good research, which is what academics like, to translating this, which is quite hard work. But sometimes people say, actually, it's been quite fun translating my research into something that's usable. I've never done that before. And I've quite enjoyed it, so I will do it again. So I think we're on a sort of a slight gap, which we're now joining up better than we ever did before. And that is a substantial part of our new agenda.
Okay, thank you. I was very interesting that DIF isn't quite clear about that. Where people in the research community or the lobbying community are not so clear about that. So that's a very useful message to come out of this.
Jump in on that one
okay.
now. Yeah, I think one of the things you raised, which is really interesting, is the whole notion of making research user-friendly, and that was not working very effectively. And I think one of the challenges for a lot of agencies has been that there have been a lot of assumptions about what user-friendly means. It means doing policy briefs in a lot of situations and trying to write a policy brief in simple language that can then somehow get distributed and somehow lead to use. And in some situations that might work, but I think in a lot of situations it doesn't work very well at all. And when you think of the first context I mentioned of strong demand from policymakers for the research, they don't need a policy brief. They just need to know the information. They don't want anything packaged. They just want the data. They can then move on and make use of it. When you're trying to get policymakers to figure out the leadership problems, again, it's often not the packaging of the research. It's what are the institutional questions that we have to deal with if we're going to make this policy change. So it takes, and then obviously as you go further down the chain, you have lots more around advocacy. You have many different types of ways you need to present the policy, whether it's a brief, whether it's a media spot, whether it's creating a funny announcement, a slogan. There are all sorts of different ways that it becomes user-friendly. And the challenge is to be able to be open enough in that kind of support to be able to have that range of options opened up.
Very good. Okay. Thanks, Fred. Well, we've had quite a lot on does research influence policy, lots of good examples from Fred, and the kinds of roles of the different actors in that, which was question 3, who needs to do what? We haven't talked very much about methods for evaluating the impact of research. We've got a few minutes left. I wonder whether anybody wants to explore that. There was a hand, your hand was up at the back. If it's not on that, if nobody wants to explore that, we can move on to something else. Do you want to explore this? Okay, let's do a little bit on methodologies. We'll come back to you at the end.
My name is Giorgio Cometto. I am the Deputy Head of Health and HIV with Save the Children, and I'd like to thank you both for your interesting presentations. I had a question on methodology to Annette. You presented a number of methodologies and you started from a qualitative research. I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. I'm not a researcher myself. I'm on the receiving end of research, and even though we collaborate obviously on a number of research activities, and having trained in quantitative methodologies as part of my medical training, I'm always I have an instinctive reluctance towards qualitative methodologies. I see them. Perhaps it's my bias. I recognize very much so that it is my bias, but I see qualitative methodologies really more as a useful complement to quantitative methodologies, but I rarely see them as a useful tool, as a standalone kind of research. And there are, if you apply only qualitative methodologies, I think it's very difficult to draw the line between what is research and evidence and what is opinion. I was wondering if you could expand on what role you think qualitative methodology has on its own. Thank you.
Stephen, did you want to ask a question there or make a comment on this question?
Same issue. I mean, are there really any quantitative methods out there that are in use? I've never seen any. I think it's almost all case studies and qualitative. I think the notion that this is susceptible to measurement it's not obvious to me that that's true, at least the way, as much as we understand now. I've never seen anything that was really quantitative in impact assessment, but I'll defer to Fred on that one.
Okay. There was an interesting paper in Cairo from the Campbell collaboration which tried to do it. It was a systematic review of something like 6,000 documents. They only found 28 which actually provided useful quantitative information, so I think you're probably at least partially right on that one. Lady at the back, do you want to lob a question in at this stage? We'll have time for a couple more questions. We'll come back to the speakers or a comment.
Hi, I'm Emily Wilson. I work for Elders at the Institute of Development Studies. It's not related to methodological stuff though. It's more to do with our discussion earlier on about the role of, who's communicating the research. We probably belong to this family of intermediaries that was mentioned earlier on. I just wanted to touch on the idea of who's conducting the research. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, because one of the things that we try to do is create what we refer to as a diversity of perspective. We find what Elders does is we kind of source free online research for everyone to access. It's not a paid service, but we find a lot of this that comes from what might be referred to as northern sources. So I just wondered if you could just touch upon this idea of who's doing the research and perhaps the sort of competing, different researchers perhaps contradicting themselves, and how these policy makers, although I agree with the gentleman who mentioned about what do we mean by policy makers, but how do decision makers deal with that idea, I suppose.
Very good, thank you. Anybody got a burning question they want to lob in before we give the floor back to Annette and Fred? I don't see burning hands. Annette, you want to deal with the methodological ones, and then both of you maybe talk about the... Sorry? Sorry. You need to really...
Hello, my name is Miriam. I wanted to say, to make a comment that links between the institutional issue and the methodological issue. Because I studied in Brazil, did undergrad there, and I'm studying now in London at the LSE, and the clearest thing that I saw was the difference, and the clear difference that there is between the researcher and the public policy and the practice. While in Brazil, you have these supermen that the lady was talking about. Every researcher is connected in public policy making. All my professors were connected to some governmental project going on, and amazing creative public policy has come up from that. But of course there is a problem, because those are people who have little private life, because you cannot be a researcher, be very well equipped in methodology, and yet be working, be doing the. And as I see that here in London at least, research works a lot more like an industry, very clear division of work, how things work. So I had the same concern as you as to who the job of communicating what is being created, because qualitative methods can be very systematic, but it's more elaborate technique. You can even use quantitative or mixed methods approach within qualitative, but there should be a person that is as skillful as a researcher, but is not producing research, is disseminating research. A person that is highly trained, but is focused on passing the research that already is, instead of creating new. Maybe that is something that has to do with the institutional organization, creating a category of people who are highly trained, could be researchers, but are actually working on dissemination of quality research. That's just...
Very good, thank you very much. I'm glad I was persuaded to give you the microphone. Very important points there. Annette, Fred?
Yeah, that was a really interesting point to end on, really, in a way, in that I mean, I actually work within a medical school, and we have this growing cadre of people who are funded as kind of physician scientists or clinician researchers. And the idea is you buy out your very best people from clinical work and you turn them into researchers, and they will be extremely good research communicators. And this is, I have real concerns about what that means, the opportunity cost to the National Health Services of that kind of, before we even get to whether they're going to be good researchers or good research communicators. But there are certainly some programs of work around at the moment that are very much about addressing this issue. And I think kind of the second bit of that is this really interesting idea about why in different contexts researchers and policymakers are more connected than others. And I've just been doing some work in Scotland where it's just a smaller community. People know each other. People have that connectivity from being part of a smaller country that's very different, I think, to our context. And so there are some of those very practical issues about being part of a larger country, I guess. In terms of the qualitative methods, I think you're right to say that the majority of studies are qualitative, are mixed method qualitative, but at the same time there are people doing quantitative research in this field, and particularly a suggestion that we could be doing much more surveying as long as it was alongside qualitative method. I don't think there's anybody out there saying it's a field where we should be entirely relying on quantitative methods, but there is some complementarity, and that just because it's difficult doesn't mean that we might not be able to get something out of it. And at the same time, quite a lot of work on developing bibliometrics so that they can give us some more meaningful data around particularly things like how research gets into policy documents and going beyond what they call a zero-order approximation, which is just saying because it got into something, it's made a difference. To actually say, well, actually, what does it mean for something to get into a document, but really be influential within that document? So to be in, I did some mapping once which showed that a lot of research is in the background sections of policy documents, if it's there at all, not in terms of ideas for action and evaluation in that kind of unit. So it's how they're being used. So I think this is a field probably where, rather than in medical research, where quantitative research dominates and qualitative research is kind of used to fill the gaps. I think this is a field where qualitative research drives the way, and we might be thinking about how quantitative research could contribute more in the future.
Very good, thank you very much. And Fred, you had a second bite at the cherry halfway through, so you get a bit less time now.
Okay, I'll take less time, or I'll try to. I don't think that the qualitative-quantitative debate is a methods question at all. I think it's a data question. I think that whatever we're what is primarily important is what are we trying to find out and for what purpose. Out of that, the methods that we use follow. And there aren't that many methods that we use, especially because we tend to mix a lot of methods together in doing a study where you don't have both qualitative and quantitative data that come into play. So I think if we try to think about it as more of a data issue than a method issue, we're a lot further ahead. Because then we take the question back to what are we trying to find out and why do we need to know? Then we can say what's the best way to actually figure out how to get there. And that may be quantitative primarily with quantitative data, or it may be with qualitative data primarily. But I think a lot of the debate, certainly in the development community, around what we mean by impact evaluation has been driven by this split around, it has to be an econometric model or it has to be a fully participatory model, without saying, well, what are we trying to find out? What do we need to know? And you see in most methods, and you see in all sides of that debate now, a shift to saying, yeah, we have some quantitative data needs around what's the economic change over the course of intervention, but we also need, in order to understand why that happened, there are lots of qualitative aspects to the process that become extremely important. And just quickly on who's conducting the research, in terms of the research we did, it's research conducted by Southern Researchers, but I would agree that a lot of it is done in the North or driven by Northern questions and Northern situations. I think we've had the privilege as an agency to be able to have that driven primarily by our partners in the South.
Very good. Thank you very much, Fred. Thank you very much, Annette. Thank you very much, everybody in the audience. I won't really try and summarize. You'll be pleased to hear. 3 words struck me as being very important. The first one was, I think Fred said about intent. clarity of intent determines what you need to do wherever you work in this spectrum, and having that clarity will help to decide what to do. Context, the context you're working in will also be vitally important, and understanding of that to determine what you should do, what the best method is to use. And Annette's emphasis on the importance of having a framework rather than individual methods. And if you've got the right framework, if you've got the intent, if you understand the context you're working in, you can then figure out what you need to do in order to try and maximise the impact of research on policy. So thank you very much, everybody. There are drinks next door. We will try and get the report up on the website in the next day, and we'll try and get the PowerPoint presentations up there very shortly after. And although this is being streamed, it will also be saved as a podcast, so you can take it home and play it with your friends.